Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Daniel Osterdahl. Welcome to our weekly conversation with my friend Peter Koning. Peter, how are you? It's good to have you back. We have so much to talk about.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me again. It's always a pleasure. It's fun. Go ahead.
We're certainly gonna get a lot of people hooked on the show because there's just so much claptrap out there, so much frivolous nonsense. And a lot of the stuff that I look at American politics. I look at Candace Owens and this guy Nick Fuentes, and they talk about things I didn't even know what they're talking about. Like I have no idea. They're talking about Charlie Kirk. They're still talking about Charlie Kirk. I think it was more than how many 6, 7, 8 months ago? Or a year? I can't even remember. And they're still talking about it and bringing up all kinds of names and conspiracies. And I guess it's interesting if you're American, but I'm not American, thank God. You're not American, thank God. Okay, and so it's a non sequitur. It really makes no difference at all to anybody in the world. Okay, outside a very small group of people who are actually interested in who all these individuals are. So again, there's like very little material out there that looks at things the way we look at it conceptually. Now, you sent me an article the other day, and I want to talk to you about it today. Um, but before we get into it, I want our audience, I want to give a brief summary. Okay, it was an amazing article. I love reading it. It's titled "What's Next Towards a Happiness Economy: Life in the World with New what was it? Well-being Criteria." Okay, and what you argue in the article is that the world is not simply facing a crisis, but a systemic transition. That current geopolitical tensions, energy disruptions, economy instability, they reflect a deeper breakdown of the existing global order based on financial abstractions, on endless growth, on inadequate metrics like GDP. And so GDP, the central measure of progress, okay, is criticized for failing to capture what you call real human well-being. It can rise even during war, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because happiness and war and killing don't really have much in common. Okay, which exposes a fundamental flaw in how value is defined. And at the same time, your text suggests that constant focus on conflict reinforces the system itself by keeping populations reactive and also anchored in fear. I thought that was very, very interesting. And as an alternative, you highlight the emergence of what you call happiness economy. We're going to be talking about that today, where success is measured through well-being rather than material output. And you give an example, Bhutan's growth, national happiness, similar frameworks, which we touched on very briefly last week, which indicate a kind of a gradual shift toward a more human-centered model. So, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the key conclusion is that we are at a crossroads. And either the current system intensifies, in other words, driven by control, by conflict, by abstraction, or a new paradigm emerges, a redefining wealth, redefining progress, redefining purpose around human well-being. And the direction I think would take as humanity will depend on whether societies remain reactive or actively shape what comes next. Did I get that, right, or is there something that I missed?
No, no, you got it. You got it right. It's a redefinition of wealth. Wealth as we understand it today is made up of indicators, of linear indicators, of physical indicators, of counting assets, counting monetary values, and so on. And the GDP, GNP, and so on, all of these go in that direction. The most stupid $2 per day income is the poverty line and so on. All of that, if you really look at it seriously, as I've luckily had the opportunity during 30 years to look at the world in reality, and confronting people who have made up these indicators like the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. You see how nonsensical there is, but it's very, very funny to see, or funny, it's sad to see that the world still accounts for them and still goes along with them. You can't imagine how many comments I've received saying, yes, I like your article. Yes, I like your theory, but I don't believe it will ever happen. We cannot move away from that. We have a monetary system that we are enslaved. Some of them who understand what it is all about said we are enslaved to this monetary system. We cannot get away from it. Yet there are countries who are trying very hard to get away from it. And some of the comments, well, about Bhutan particularly, I've received, and especially one from a friend. He said, yes, that sounds very good, but Bhutan is indebted. They have big debts. Yes, yes, they're indebted by the very system that they are fighting, because they have not been able, like other countries have, like Argentina has at the time, to just say, stop. No more money from the World Bank, IMF, and all these institutions, Asian Development Bank, stop. They have not been able to do that. They were somehow pressured into it. It's a small country between two huge countries, so it's very difficult. But they are working into the direction. It's not perfect, but perfection, as you know, is the enemy of the good. So if we look at what they have achieved, and there are others, I used two examples. Vanuatu was another one. They use different indicators, but going into the similar direction, and that they use different indicators actually speaks for the fact that itself that they want to move away from a global uniform system of accounting for GDP, because with GDP and with linear indicators, because linear indicators cannot be globalized. They are globalized, but they do not have any value internationally, because we are working with different cultures, different beliefs, and so they have to be adjusted to different sets of beliefs. And so you're absolutely right. We are going into a direction at the crossroads where we have to choose. Either we succumb to this system, and we'll slowly go down the drain, or we choose a different way. And the choosing a different way is not only, hold on. The choosing a different way is not only just an economic affair. It's a social affair. It's how we deal with each other. It's instead of competing with each other and hitting ourselves over the heads to be a number one, we would cooperate with each other, and we would, instead of buying up a company that is broke, we help it to continue, and so on. So this is a different approach to human harmony, to human relationships. And I think that's the direction we should eventually go. Whether there are enough people who say, yes, we can, or not, is a different, Jesus, sorry.
That's okay.
Is a different question, and but I believe it's a way that we can, and the more we talk about it, for example, the more people will start understanding what we are really talking about.
So let's look at the metaphysical dimension. So if reality is increasingly mediated through systems, financial, digital, narrative, how do we distinguish, Peter, between what is happening and what is being constructed? Let me give you, for example, if we look at the layers, so material, energy, logistics, production, okay, that's hard reality. Systemic, markets, policies, that's interpreted reality. And narrative, you have media, you have language, which is a constructed reality. And so the higher you go, the more distortion you get. Okay, so you can track constraints and not stories. In other words, reality shows up as limits, energy shortages, supply disruptions, credit tightening. And so narratives explain, constraints reveal. And then if we ask for follow incentives, if we ask who benefits if this is believed, what behavior is being pushed. And so these constructed realities are designed to shape action. And so I think the bottom line is you never see a raw reality. We only see layers of it. And so I think the key question is not, is this true, which is what a lot of people ask, but what layer am I looking at and who shaped it?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. Let me give you another example, one that we're living lately almost every day. The example of wars and conflicts. What do you think for the United States, wars and conflicts and the whole military industrial complex, as you call it, accounts for more than 50% of
Wow.
GDP. So and I call GDP because that is still the common denominator for our success. Our success is made through wars and killing, and in our Western system. This is what is success. So we have to get away from that. We have to break off this system, and it's systemic. You're absolutely right. The thing is, people don't know. People don't understand that. They understand that there's going to be a crisis, a world crisis of energy. There may be unemployment, supply chains disruptions, and poverty, and so on. But they do not understand what the reason is behind it. The mainstream focuses on the details, and the details is exactly that. And Trump plays with it, and Trump's people, not Trump himself, because he doesn't have the intelligence to do that. But the people behind him, they play with this, with people's understanding, people's worries that there will soon be not enough energy to heat their homes, to supply the food, to create fertilizers in order to nourish them and so on. And the inflation will grow. And I mean, there's an innumerable an amount of consequences which people are worried about, but they do not see the big picture. They do not see what is really behind it.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned GDP when we talked about GDP. So if GDP, which again, a lot of people don't understand, can grow during war, can grow during crisis, can grow during destruction, what exactly is it measuring? And why do we still trust it?
It is, yeah, exactly. Why do we still trust it? It's measuring nothing less than added value, and added value is normally, the very origin of the added value has been celebrated on May 1st in almost all of the world as
Except Canada and the United States.
except for the United States. Exactly. Except for the, and labor is the really the origin of added value, and that has of course no longer the case. Added value is legal fees that go up exponentially. That is added value. The banking fees that go up, interest is added value, and that added value of the Scion-made bank system is actually also accounting for our Ponzi scheme, which is enslaving us at the same time. Exactly what we have to get away from. So we are basically in a circle. It's like a vicious circle. You would call it a catch-22, and it's very, very difficult to break out of it. But you can. You just have to recognize it, and it takes a little effort, but it's possible. And there are countries that have started, even OECD countries, as you may have seen. OECD countries have quietly started looking at alternatives. They don't make them public yet, because it's too dangerous if the people start understanding what's going on. So they quietly look at what could be an alternative if everything starts breaking down. And I think we really have to capitalize on this people's understanding and people's worries. Take the fear away and say, look, there are alternatives. We have access to these alternatives. They're right in front of our eyes. Just look at your well-being, look how unhappy you are, and start thinking of what would make you happy. Stress doesn't make you happy.
Do you think we're approaching a point where financial systems detach completely from physical reality? In other words, energy and food and production, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry?
Well, I said, do you think? Um, what did I ask? Are we approaching a point where financial systems detach completely from physical reality?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I think the financial system that we have is it's serving for a big portion of our population to buy food, to buy energy, to buy whatever is necessary to make a living, housing, and so on. But what it is basically, what it has become famous for is to account for the riches of the people. You have such and such an income, therefore you fall into a category of the upper, the higher, the middle 10% or the 50% and so on. So it has totally disconnected itself from reality because there are societies. I worked for a long time in Africa, and Africa hasn't changed. I recently was again in Africa. It's actually gotten worse. There's 70% probably, around 70% of the rural population of Africa that is not monetized. And still they are judged by $2 per day of income as a poverty line. People in the Peruvian and Bolivian and in the Andean countries and the highlands, they basically do not know money. They barter with each other. So that's their income basis. And if they would not be confused with all those that escape to Lima and other big cities and have to live in slums and work for nothing, beg in the streets and so on. If they would know that, because they don't dare to go back and tell them, if they would know that, they would appreciate how happy they are by not being involved in our current monetary system.
So you
So,
mentioned in your in again in the article what drew my attention more than anything else is it's a totally different concept. We're talking about happiness economy. In other words,
yeah.
a future economy, social economy, without stealing a portion of our income, a future society and economy where banking is public and interest free, where additional values achieved by work belong to those who have worked for the added values. And where wealth is not accounted for with material growth, consumption, and possession, but, as you say, by societal harmony, by peace, by spiritual growth. In other words, wealth, as in happiness, is possible. Now, somebody who is listening to us, somebody who was brought up in Western society, in capitalism, where you buy, for $2, you sell for five, where you always look for ways, to get more, squeeze more out of whoever is doing good work by paying them less. Is this realistic? Okay, or is it only realistic in a very small strata of society in some fourth world countries in the middle of nowhere and has no relevance to Western capitalist model?
The examples that I mentioned in my article are about two relatively small countries. One is a small, really tiny country. The other is an island, which is not big either. Let me look at China. China has actually, they use GDP. They use that so that they can compare themselves with the United States particularly and with the West, and that they can continue competing. But if you are living in China, the income of most of the average people has nothing to do. They are not actually running after more income. Most of them are not, because the banking system, if China if the Chinese growth rate, which is judged according to our Western standards, if the Chinese growth rate goes down, then of course China is in big problem. If it has been 12, 14% for many years and it's now down to 6% and maybe going down to 5% as it has been last year and is projected to be again 5%, that doesn't mean that China is doing something wrong or is going into the wrong direction. That simply means that China has shifted its economy from a vertical economy, from one that is growing vertically to one that is growing horizontally, meaning equalizing the system within China. That I have been experiencing personally, because I've been invited to several places where the infrastructure base is very low, where school constructions and working opportunities are very low. So they're now investing. There's 4,000 banks. Almost all of them are not banks like we know them, private banks. They have a mandate. They invest. If they go broke, it doesn't matter. They're never going broke. They're being reinvested because they have to accomplish a certain goal. And that goal is to build a certain infrastructure, not only a physical infrastructure, but a social infrastructure with people's growth. So this is a country that has a different approach. It's not the Bhutan approach, it's not the Vanuatu approach, but this approach which is equalizing the economy to a certain level. Doesn't mean that they don't have any oligarchs and extremely rich people. They do. Of course they do. But the big portion of the people, they are living on an income, and they are not unhappy with their income. They don't really worry about the control system. That's the interesting part of it, where we are constantly worried about our control system or their control system. We don't know about ours, so we ignore it. But their control system serves for them a purpose, and the purpose is to keep a society which is as secure as you can be. That there is no theft. Of course, there's corruption, there's theft. You cannot, the complete eradicating of the bad is impossible. But they are at the level where there's no risk for anybody to walk around at night and being afraid of being attacked or somebody being stolen. It's absolutely inconceivable. So this is another factor of well-being, not being afraid of being robbed or attacked or raped, or all of these factors, they count into our Western system,
So
where
let me
we're
ask you about
advancing very rapidly with our Western economy.
what you're saying is there's a doubt or a question I have or the element of it, the geopolitical restraint. In other words, states don't operate in isolation, and even if one country optimizes for well-being, others optimize for power. Technological races continue, resources competition persists. What does it mean that a state cannot ignore GDP, industrial capacity, energy security without weakening itself? So a full transition is blocked by what? By geopolitics. And so then I also see another problem is how do you measure this? In other words, happiness sounds intuitive, but it's extremely difficult to define. Now, if you live on a Robinson Crusoe Island, in other words, where you do and make everything yourself and you take profit from that, your work yourself, then everything is fine. But if you live within a society, now, so the question is, this happiness as a concept, is it subjective? In other words, how people feel. Objective, because now we're talking about health, we're talking about safety, as you mentioned, we're talking about income, or cultural, community, tradition, spirituality. Who decides? And I think this creates a critical risk. In other words, again, neither you or I have an answer. There's no answer to this, okay, which is one of the reasons I love talking to you, because we can debate and discuss any number of topics from a totally different vantage point. But the question is, who decides? And this creates, I think, a critical risk, because the metric can be politicized or engineered. And so if institutions define well-being, they also define what counts as good life, what behaviors are encouraged or discouraged, as we see in China. And at that point, well-being becomes, I guess you could say, a tool of governance, okay? And so I see two possible trajectories, two scenarios. Scenario A, you have genuine transformation. Policies shift towards human flourishing. You have work, you have health, communities improve, economic growth becomes a means, not an end. I think this is the optimistic path. Whether it can be, implemented on planet Earth, knowing the way people are, I don't know. Okay, and scenario B is System optimization. I see it, more logical. It makes more sense. In other words, well-being metrics are used to stabilize populations. Discontent is managed, not solved. And the system becomes more adaptive, but also more subtle in control. And so in this version, happiness, okay, becomes part of the interface. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so. Very much so, because it is a very, you're right. It's a very difficult question of what is happiness? Is happiness defined objectively or subjectively? So in both cases that I cited here, Vanuatu and Bhutan, they have questions which go in both directions. They have indicators, particularly in Vanuatu, they have indicators which are social indicators for happiness, which concerns the statistics, which concerns the whole society. But at the same time, they recheck them periodically with individual questioning. There are people that they get 50 to 100 questions asked, what they have to answer personally. How do they feel? Are they happy? And what elements of happiness corresponds to what factor? Are they stressed? Are they afraid of losing their jobs? Are they afraid of being sick and not having access to a health center or to medical care and so on? These are questions which are very subjective, but they are factored into the happiness component. For example, I think the last one that came out in Bhutan was 2022, and it came out with I think close to 0.8 of people's happiness, one being the top.
Right.
So everybody is totally happy, so that they actually account for factors which people say, well, we would like this to be different and so on. In Vanuatu, I didn't get one of those indicators. I was researching for it, but I didn't get it. But still, they have a different culture. They have a different system. So these, I would say, are more subjective, yet including objective indicators as a happiness as happiness indices. But in China, it's more systemic. They have to do something with so many people. Of course, there are inquiries. They are pretty much also constant inquiries, but it's pretty much a system where they try to first equalize society. I mean, China has always gone forward in huge steps, but planned. They're looking forward. They're looking not necessarily, they're looking back in order to learn lessons. And then they look forward in order to equalize society and bringing new systems about. And a very interesting example that with artificial intelligence that I just came across this during this weekend. We have a number of maybe 10, 12 different Western sources of artificial intelligence, and all of them are coordinated. All of them are actually coordinated. So in other words, I cannot say, well, I don't believe ChatGTP, so I go to another one. But all have the same actually narrative. They follow the same narrative. There are certain red lines they cannot cross. So that's where the AI control comes in. If I want to go to living in the West, living where we are now, going to DeepSeek, which is the Chinese ones, would you believe I cannot? I cannot with my email, which is not a Gmail or anything controlled by Google. I cannot access it. I have to first register with the Google type of email, which is controlled, of course, by CIA, so that the people know what kind of questions do I ask. So it's being censored in the West. Now, the only way I haven't tried yet is going through it with VPN, putting my cursor, my computer into China somewhere and see whether it will be possible to access it through that. I haven't tried that yet, but it's maybe a possibility. But you see, all of this is controlled by the West. You're absolutely constrained by uh, how shall I say? It's of course a sensor system, but it's more than a sensor system. It's also a system of the information you can get, information that has been accumulated and concentrated by other societies are not easily accessible in the West.
Different stratas of society have access to different information. So let me summarize. I want to talk about Vanuatu, but just to summarize what we talked about, the happiness economy. I think a happiness economy, it's not a revolution, okay? I think it's a signal, okay? A signal that the current system no longer explains reality, no longer delivers legitimacy, and is being quietly adjusted. And I think the real question is not whether it is realistic, it is who defines what well-being means and to what end. Because once you define it, you're no longer just measuring reality, you are shaping it.
Absolutely. Exactly. So you're right. It's not a revolution because if we confront it, if we present it as a revolution, nobody will go for it. But and it is not a revolution. It's actually a different way of looking at our own lives, a different way of looking at how we evolve from one day to another, and not last, looking at our disease pattern that we have. The cancer rates, independent of COVID vaccines, the cancer rate is shifting and is increasing. And if you look at the factors that influence cancers, it's actually very easy. It's fear and frustration and unhappiness.
Yeah.
Unhappiness. We somatize. We somatize unhappiness into physical illness. And if we start realizing that, then it's an opening, it's a door opener towards a new system, a new way of thinking, what makes us happy, what makes people not fighting each other, but cooperating with each other
Working together, yeah.
and working together and living in harmony together. That is happiness, not your
You
physical
have, you have
wealth.
two models. I always explain to people it this way. You have two models. You have this model, okay, which is, let's work together, let's cooperate, let's, look after, our elderly, let's make sure the young are, looked after, and we give them the good education, the good basis to become, productive members of society, and everybody works together. And there's this model where the elite is saying, you are going to work for me. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to rape you. I'm going to steal everything from you. I'm going to enslave you. I'm going to eat you if I have to. Okay, or if I don't, I'll eat you anyway. And then everything yours is going to become mine. So these are the two models. So,
Right.
and they're obviously exclusive. It's one or the other. And so I think we're not witnessing the end of an economic cycle. We're witnessing the end of a way of measuring reality. That's it. The system will change. There's no doubt about it. Okay, and that is already underway. We may not know what the new system is going to look like because we don't have the language to define this new world, right around the bend. But I think the real question is, who defines what comes next? Centralized structures of control, decentralized model of human-centered values, because I think ultimately the future will not be decided in markets. It will be decided in how we, the people, define, or society defines wealth, how we define well-being, how we define freedom, and that redefinition has already begun.
Absolutely. I think the definition has already begun, but it's not yet made public. I think there are some politicians who realize that the system is at the end, but cannot make it public because, uh, whether we want to see it or not, any politician who's himself would like a new system to come about and see that the future is not on this dogs eat dogs society, but in a society of cooperation, and wants to play that out. He risks his life in our system because that system that we are in is at its final round, and like a wild beast, slashes around it and tries to bring down as many people, as many countries as possible in order to survive as long as possible. So, and that I think is maybe one of the hindrances that we are confronted with to bring in the new system. But that it will change, it will, and it has to come from the people. It has to come from people who are not afraid, who people said, yes, it's a possibility. We can do that. And there are organizations, for example, there is an organization which is a franchise called Business National Business Network International. Have you heard about it?
No.
It's a franchise that covers, I think, 84 countries or 83 countries in the world, and it has maybe in total close to 400,000 members, corporations, corporations, mostly small and medium sized, not so large ones yet. But they're professing this type of new approach to doing business with each other instead of against each other. And that's quite successful. I know the manager of the franchise here in Peru. There is one. They have about 2,000 members here in Peru, and in Switzerland they have about, I think, close to 4,000 members, and so on. And it exists in the United States. It's and of course, even in China, it's a system which is based on franchise. It's a McDonald's for big business,
Yeah.
for being doing ethical business. And it's possible.
Peter, you mentioned Vanuatu before. Again, for people who don't know where that is, it's in the French Polynesia, way there. It's like, if you go a little bit further, that's the end of the earth. You see dinosaurs and dragons. And basically, if you go too far, you can just fall off the planet Earth. Pretty much. Anyway, it's way back there, but it's a beautiful place. I've never been there, but it's an amazing place. Okay, so I wanted to ask you, and the reason I know it's an amazing place because I have lots of people in the government who have been there, Russian government, and I've seen tons of images of, and it really is beautiful, spectacular. So I wanted to ask you, Benoit, we talked last week, talked about Bhutan, okay? Why Vanuatu? Why is it important? And is it because Vanuatu demonstrates that there's no single alternative model, or because in micro in Vanuatu we can apply in macro on a global stage?
Well, I think it's maybe a little bit of both. I think what both countries have and what also China has, if you look at it, they play out neutrality. In the case of Vanuatu, they have a saying is that we are everybody's friend and nobody's enemy. And they don't have a neutrality built into their constitution, but they just act diplomatically neutral. And so does Bhutan. And so does China, if we know. China is actually not taking firm roles or open roles. China is not expanding in a way that the West wants to expand its power. And in many, many cases, China is acting as a mediator, a mediator for, I think in the case of Iran, they are a mediator, they are in a mediating role too. They have been in Pakistan, for example, to mediate the conversations that lasted not even 24 hours.
Yeah.
And so on. So this kind of the concept of neutrality as a basis for peace. And if you say peace, then you say automatically a step towards happiness. And I think that's the direction I guess the world has to go. Instead of taking roles and defending, you take roles. It's an active neutrality. You take roles in as much as you defend certain laws, international laws, which were made by humans, like the human rights and the Geneva Conditions and all of these laws that once were established for the good of the people, they have no longer values. They have been abandoned during the last 20 years and taken over by rules-based orders. And now it's not even rules-based orders, it's Trump's-based orders. So it has nothing to do anymore with legality. And we have to get back to that. And the way to get back is through a political neutrality, by saying, what we want is to be, as Vanuatu says very clearly, we want to be friends with everybody and enemies of nobodies. No, we are open to all kinds of relationships.
Peter, so the Vanuatu system again is rooted in local reality. Okay, now let me ask you this, and then I have ideas of my own on this. Can local realities be applied in Western countries? Because again, we're talking about two totally different models. Okay, or does it work as a kind of a decentralized layer inside a larger system? I mean, you're an economist. You've worked with underprivileged countries in the Middle East, in Africa, and Southeast Asia, in Latin America. So you're more than qualified to answer this. How would that work?
Yes. And yes, of course, that's a very good question, because it does work. It can work in a decentralized system. Decentralized in the sense, take Europe. It's not a miracle that the European Union has been set up. It's not an idea of Europe that the European Union has been set up. It's an idea of the system of the United States. In order to control better the European Union, you have to clump them together, and
Yeah,
make
makes it easier. Yeah.
but if we go back to sovereign countries, I think there is no continent as small as Europe is, with so many different cultures that could play out. Italy, I just looked at the map. Italy has about 100 American uh,
Basis.
bases. Yes, but you can call them bases, or yeah, it's unbelievable. So and Spain, you know that too. It's very, very much the same.
Yeah.
So if we go back to sovereign countries with sovereign currencies, where each currency is made by the country itself, by the people actually, we come a far way towards the possibility of countries defining their own happiness and well-being indicators. But grouping them together doesn't work. Especially not grouping them together in war organizations like NATO, or the European Union, and similar organizations that exist around the world. I think is absolutely senseless. That's why the different Asian groupings of countries, they never want to dominate the politics. They let play out the national cultures. National monetary policies are made always by the countries themselves. So it's not something which is being dominated by one single currency. To the contrary, actually, I think China encourages trading in local currencies rather than one specific currencies. Of course, these local currencies a country can choose what currencies they would like to use, because they probably would like to use a currency which they deal most with, where they have most business relationships with. So, but what is essential to answer your question is, yes, it is possible, but we have to be decentralized. We have to be, again, going back to sovereign nations where cultures play a role, and where cultures are a key indicator towards the formation of a happiness structure.
I think what local reality, when you think about it, what does it really mean? I think it's the idea that value systems are context specific. That well-being is culturally defined, obviously. French culture is different from Spanish culture, from Italian, and so forth. And so on. And so policy should reflect local conditions, not abstract national averages. In other words, in practice, you have different regions optimizing for different priorities. Okay, and in fact, we can see fragments of this. In other words, cities designated policies around livability, mobility, housing, regions in Italy, in France and Spain, for example, prioritizing industry and tourism or environment differently. You have local governments experimenting with well-being indicators, even in the United States and Canada. And so you have Western systems, they are already partly localized, I guess you could say, not just fully acknowledged as such, but they're on the way. Now, why is it harder to scale? I think Western countries, they face structural constraints. One of them is centralization. You have national regulations, they dominate. You have fiscal control, which is centralized. You have policy uniformity is often enforced. Okay. Also, you have cultural fragmentation. Okay. No single shared definition of well-being. Okay. That's a multi-cultures we're talking about in the West. You have conflicting values across regions and groups. And as the third point, you have the economic integration. In other words, regions depend on what? On national and global systems. We talked about this earlier. You have local autonomy is limited by supply chain, capital flow, labor mobility. Now, where can it realistically work from my vantage point? I think local reality works at city and regional levels. Public services, for example, health or education or urban planning, quality of life policies. I mean, there should be a ministry, I think, in every government, in every country. Okay, they have the Minister of Sports. Well, there should be Ministry of Quality of Life. Okay, examples. One region optimizes for economic growth. Another region optimizes for environmental and lifestyle. Another region for industrial resilience. Okay, you have the same country, you have different regions and different models. Now, what's the risk? Because I think a local reality can also lead to inequality between regions. We see that in Russia, fragmentation of national identity, policy inconsistencies, fragmentation of national identity. You have the Chechnya, Dagestan region, which gets a lot of money from the Russian government as a result of the agreement in the first and the second Chechen war. Okay, so the system needs a balance. It needs a local flexibility. It needs central coordination. Now, what it becomes is not a replacement of the Western model, but a layer of I guess you could say, adaptive governance. In other words, a system where the national level ensures stability and the local level defines a living reality. Okay, what's the bottom line? That I think local reality can be applied in Western countries, but only as a controlled decentralization, not fully autonomous. But my question is, as a last question before we end today's show, is do you think that controlled decentralization in a centralized system as the Western system could actually work?
It would work, but what we have to do, I think the first step to what you were just explaining would be that, for example, the European Union breaks down either by itself or is being broken down by its members, so that every member country can become again a sovereign nation. And within these sovereign nations, you mentioned the differences within countries. That's true. In the south of France, you probably have different values than in the north of France. Even in Vanuatu, they have recently added to their indicators tourism. Tourism is something which is very important for Vanuatu. So the happiness of tourism and how it affects the people is very important for them. It's not important for many other countries, maybe. For Italy, it may be also very important. So, but the first step to that is to break down these artificially made unions. The NATO is a union artificially made that should have been resolved in 1990, 1991, and still exists and still dominates. The European Union that makes absolutely no sense with one single currency of 27 different countries with 27 different cultures makes no sense, will not be able to survive. It survives only because it is based on the dollar Ponzi scheme, where actually private bank make 95% of the money. And if we can get to that, if people understand this and step out from these unions and say, we are a sovereign nation, we want to be free to make our own policies and our own happiness policies with the Ministry of Well-being, for example, it is possible. I think it is possible. But the first step is we have to break down these artificially made unions, which have been made only to dominate with the financial system, which is, of course, also dominated by the Bank for International Settlement through their dictate on.
Subsidiaries the world over. Peter, we're out of time. Wonderful to have you on. Until next Monday, let's do this again. So let's see if we can, stick to a schedule, like maybe on Monday, unless one of us can do it, obviously. But so again, thanks for doing this, and it's going to be up now in the next hour or so. So talk to you next week. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.